You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
HRN is food radio supported by you. Learn more at heritageradionetwork.org.
Westholme is working with the land to create nature-led Australian Wagyu. Westholme believes that when nature leads, flavor follows. Learn more at westholme.com.
Culture and Flavor is a podcast about food and culture centered in Black and Indigenous foodways. Hosted by myself, Zella Palmer, right here in New Orleans, Louisiana. Each episode features high vibrational conversations with cultural bearers, chefs, farmers, scholars, barbecue pit masters, and more. Where there is flavor, there is history. Join me on Culture and Flavor and all of my guests as we share stories that will have you praise dancing, cooking, conjuring, and inspiring your culinary journey. Welcome to another episode of Culture and Flavor. I'm so excited to have Tunde Way on, a dear friend of mine, on this episode. Tunde is from Lagos, Nigeria. He is an artist. He is a scholar, a writer. His work engages in systems that create material disparity, focusing particularly on how economics and finance impact working class Black people globally. He uses performance and installation, film, food, writing, and finance to confront disparities in material conditions and attempt interventions to address socially constructed inequalities. His work can be seen in New York Times, NPR, GQ, The Washington Post. I mean, it goes on and on and on. But I've known Tunde for, it's been a decade now, hasn't it? It's been a long time. Yeah. And when he moved to New Orleans for the first time, and he's funny, hilarious, he's full of life. And he is a dear friend and someone who I call often, when I need advice on writing or just someone I confide in. I think he feels the same way about me. So I'm so excited to have him on this episode of Culture and Flavor. So welcome, Tunde.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here and to chat with you. It's going to be fun.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. So let's just talk about your journey. Okay. For our listeners who aren't familiar with your work, I want to start just from the beginning. Little Tunde in Lagos, Nigeria.
Yeah. So just about me. Yeah. Okay. So I was born in Lagos in Luth, which is the Lagos University Teaching Hospital, I guess. And I was born a day before my mother. Not a day before, but my birth date is a day before because my mother is older than I am. And I grew up in Lagos, went to, nursery, primary, and secondary school in Lagos or around Lagos. And middle class Nigerian family, maybe slightly more than that, maybe upper middle class. But my parents, their focus was giving us the best education. So whether that was in actual schools or in through extra curricular activities, but it's not like we were super wealthy or anything, but we had everything that we wanted, and we were just educated well. We were exposed to a lot of things, and that was my sort of childhood. And I left Nigeria when I was 16, and I moved to the Detroit area. Yeah.
And when you got to Detroit, when you arrived in Detroit, I mean, just paint the scene on what it was like in Detroit at that time. And a lot of your work has been grounded in the life of being undocumented. You now have your, what they say, your papers, but
I got everything. Yeah.
But back then, yeah.
Yeah, I actually arrived with my documentation. So I came in here as I've been, if folks are interested in this sort of immigration integrity, but I came in here with a B1 visa, which is a visiting visa or a tourist visa. And when I came at the time, this was before 9/11, so I was here in 2000 at the time, and a lot of people did this. You could come to the United States and then you could change your immigration status. So there are two things. There's your immigration status and then your immigration visa. A visa is just like what allows you to travel between places, or what shows that you have this like permit, I guess, to travel between places. But then your status is just your legal status or legal immigration status in a country. So I came in with tourist visa, but then I changed my status. So what that meant was I was allowed to be in the United States as a student. So I changed it to an F1 status. So I was a student, but I didn't have a visa, which meant that I would have to like leave the country to apply for a visa so I could return, even though I had the status. It's complicated, I know, but that's the immigration system. So anyway, what that meant in it like practically was like I didn't leave even when I was documented. I didn't leave the country. I mean, generally, it wasn't a problem in that you could leave and apply, but there were just enough stories where people left and they couldn't come back, even though they had the rightful sort of or they were in the States legally. So I just stayed in the United States, and I went to school, and I wasn't really a good student, and it's sort of like there were parallel trajectories. So as my academic career was sort of diminishing in that I wasn't particularly good at what I was doing, my parents' sort of like financial wherewithal was also diminishing, and they just like both coincided at the same point. So by the time I realized that I needed to finish, because I was in community college, I needed to finish college and like go on to a 4-year college and graduate and all that stuff, my parents ran out of money. So then I didn't go to school. So I basically like dropped out, like in my third year or something. And then I became undocumented. Once you drop out of school as a foreign student and you don't, like you miss, I think 1 or 2 semesters, then you're immediately undocumented. And then I just maintained that undocumented status, or I held that rather, for the next 10 years. So for about 10 years or so, I was undocumented. But for the first 6 to 8 years that I was in the U.S., I was documented.
Mm.
Yeah.
So talk to us about just how that was, because your parents returned back to Nigeria, if I'm not mistaken. Am I correct?
Yeah, my mom came and she sort of like settled us in when we were 16, because we were still young and in a new country. We lived with my aunt, that's my mom's younger sister. And our family was tight, so I had known my aunt all my life. My aunt's children, my cousins, we kind of grew up together. So it wasn't, it wasn't a strange thing that I would live with my aunt. But anyway, she lived in Detroit, so that's why we moved to Detroit. So my mom was only here for like 6 months, and then she went back home. And then my aunt and uncle really were like our surrogate parents. But it's kind of I came at 16, turning 17. I was going to college, and so things were different. There wasn't that sort of like parental supervision, because one, I was in college, and number two, my aunt and uncle were working. Unlike Nigeria, my parents worked, but they were always present. But in the United States, I think a lot of families have this where folks are working. So my aunt, uncle were working, and so yeah, we were just doing our thing. I think Michigan rather, is at the time was a very difficult place to be undocumented, in that they did everything they could to make your life uncomfortable. There were restrictions around driving or obtaining a driver's license. I think there were some restrictions around even renting apartments and getting utilities in your name. So if you didn't have a robust support system, and thankfully a lot of undocumented folks do, then you're just in a really vulnerable position, and you're in a place to be exploited. Thankfully, I had like my family, so I had at different times when things got really critical, I had a place to go back to, whether it was my aunt's home literally, or just support emotionally and financially as well. So yeah, it was tough, but I think because of the way I was raised, credit to my parents, they just had such high expectations of me. So my circumstances were only for me just circumstantial. Like I just happened to be undocumented and I just happened to have all of these constraints, but it didn't affect the things that I wanted to do, or rather it didn't affect the dreams that I had, without sounding like, too grandiose. And this is like a movie or something, but I had ideas of how I wanted to be and live my life. And so being undocumented didn't really shake that. I mean, there were like real constraints and real worries about being detained or arrested and all that stuff. But I just kept pushing. Yeah.
So how was Detroit? You got just growing up there. I mean, it's being a teenager. Detroit is one of the Black meccas, definitely at that time in the Midwest. Right. Detroit has such a profound history and culture of Black movements, Black music. Motown is there. So much is going on. And what led you to start a pop-up, which would eventually bring you to New Orleans?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't, when I moved, I was 16. I moved in April of 2020. I was 16 then. I turned 17 that year. We were I believe, on the west side in Detroit. So we stayed, my aunt and uncle had an apartment on Greenfield and McNichols. So McNichols is 6 Mile. And we lived there for like, I think, I want to say 6 months or so before we moved to the suburbs. My aunt bought a house. So we moved out of the city. But in that time, at 16, I didn't understand Detroit as Detroit. I just understood it as America. I'm like, oh, I'm in America. And it was interesting because Detroit is, visually, at least at the time, Detroit looks, I don't know, it was all new, but at the same time, it was a little underwhelming, but also it was still like awesome. It's hard to explain. I was able to, I could see like on the streets that some of this, like the roads were not like, all paved, for example, or like there were like potholes in I could see like cars that looked kind of janky. But then I could also just see how, like these, like the buildings, the like residential buildings, like apartments, like stretched for like blocks, like 2 or 3 blocks. Like the grocery stores were huge. The sort of like the road network system, was also like well done, and the grass was manicured, like all the kinds of things that I didn't really see in urban Lagos. It's just a different vibe. So it was a multi-sensory sort of experience. I was just processing a whole bunch of things, but everything was new. Everything was like lovely. I loved everything. I used to walk from my aunt's house to a university about, I want to say like 2 miles or so away, and just to use their library. Because at the time, internet wasn't like, I mean, there was internet, but I think at home it was dial-up or something. So at the library,
I remember those days.
Yeah. I would just go and I would just chat with people. Like that was my introduction to America. I would just go into the chat rooms at 16 and I'll be chatting with people on like MSN chats. And it's just like, it's wild. I had like 3 girlfriends just from one of them sent me a picture with their picture on it and a note. I was like, wow, America.
Oh my goodness! Were back then? Did you know that you wanted to be a writer?
I had written in secondary school, right? So I'd written for like the class or the school magazine and stuff like that. My mom was a huge CNN junkie, and it just played all the time in our house. So I remember I knew like all the different presidential candidates from both parties in like 1998 or something, whenever that election was with Ross Perot and all those people. And so I wrote this article about the US elections in our class paper, and I gave like a little bio on each of the different candidates and what their prospects were and stuff like that. So I was doing that kind of writing. I wrote a lot of like letters of complaints to my mother when she sent us on holiday to like my aunt's house. I was right, like, the food here is horrible. I did stuff like that. Yeah, I was a freedom fighter. My mom used to make fun of me. She'd be like, "Do you remember when you wrote this letter and you because maybe I was like 10 or 12 when I wrote the letter. I'm like, Mommy, there's no sausage here. Why am I why was my God wrong with this African child complaining about sausages?"
Oh my goodness. That's hilarious. So, what brought you? We're going to fast forward a little bit. I think the first time I heard about you was when you were doing pop ups in Detroit. And
Mhm.
how did that come about?
So, I was undocumented, but whatever, hustling, if you will, in that, parents had expectations of me. I had expectations of myself. I moved back into the city. And so for me, like 2011 was the time that I think my life sort of became my own, in that up until that time I had just been trying to do what my parents wanted. Part of the reason why I struggled in school was because my mom wanted me to become a doctor, and so she wanted me to first become a pharmacist, then become a doctor. And it was so I was like taking classes that I didn't understand, or I didn't want to pursue. So, and I didn't have an interest in. So that was why really I wasn't doing so well. In 2011, a bunch of things happened, but 2011 was when I decided that, because I was staying in my aunt's basement, it was just me. I think my brothers had like gone to, like, they had their own places that they were staying. It was just me, and I'm like, I was 28 or something. I don't even, yeah, 28, 29. So I was like kind of old, and I'm like, man, I've had this idea of the kind of life that I wanted to live, but I was still not hewing to it, right? I was kind of halfway in, halfway out. And so 2011, I was like, I'm going to move back to the city, or move into the city proper. So I left my aunt's house, left all of that sort of like stability. I had a job that was paying me $500 a month, and I moved into an apartment with these two other white people. But I was in like the city at the time in Detroit. I was in a place called Woodbridge, and in the downtown area, the beginning of what people are now calling Detroit's resurgence sort of like started out from there. In that there were folks downtown, the sort of like political class, the quote unquote creative class, all of these people like living downtown in cheaper housing, collaborating, doing work, opening up businesses, starting restaurants, all of that stuff. So I moved into that broader like downtown community, and it was the best decision that I ever made. Even though I was only making like $500 a month, and my rent was like $350 a month, and by the time I paid all my bills, I had a deficit of like $150. It was the best decision. I met a bunch of people. One of the people that I met was my roommate, who a year after I had moved, so I think in 2012, we had met up to catch up, because I had moved out of that place that we were staying. And he was telling me all the things that he was up to and the things that he wanted to do. And one of the things that he said was open up a restaurant. And so I had just come back from Chicago because I was trying to go back to school to finish, to get my degree. And that didn't work out. So I told myself that when I come back to Detroit, I'm just going to like really take all opportunities, no matter how crazy they sounded. So when he said restaurant, I'm like, yeah, let's do it. And he didn't quite believe me, or maybe he thought I was kidding, but because of all the relationships that I had made in that year since I had moved, I was able to find a restaurant space in Detroit, or technically in Hamtramck, which is a city within the city. I was able to find the place in about 3 months. So 3 months after we had that conversation, we had a restaurant, and we each put up, I think, $4,000. So we opened up the restaurant with about $8,000. And that restaurant, became popular in the city. And that was sort of like how I started building up my name in food. But what happened was, I and my partner had differences, again, because I was undocumented. I left because, I wasn't on the business papers. So I really had no legal claim to the business. So when I left, I decided to go on this like cooking tour where I would be sharing cooking Nigerian food because I was trying to express myself through food. And my partner at the time, among other issues that we had, he had a specific idea of what our restaurant in Detroit should do. And I wanted to be more creative, at least in my own way. And so when I left, I had the chance to be creative. And the way I chose to be creative was to travel and cook Nigerian food. So I started traveling. The first place that I came to after I left my restaurant was New Orleans. That was the first dinner that I had on this tour. This was in the fall of 2014. And after that dinner, I got a bunch of press, local press in New Orleans for that dinner. So I did that. Then I left New Orleans. I traveled around some more. And towards the end of the year, I got like a random email from the folks at the St. Roch Market in New Orleans, which was a food hall that was just about to open up. They had read about my cooking tour when I had come to New Orleans, and they offered me a stall. And so that's how I came to New Orleans.
And that's how I met you. I remember I went in there because there still to this day, there isn't any restaurants that are Nigerian in New Orleans. We have Benachin, but it's more like it's been there for a while. Yeah. And then we have Dakar Nola, and then another Senegalese restaurant that's kind of near that kitchen in Uptown New Orleans. But that's it. And when you consider places like Detroit, Chicago, Houston, New York, you can go to a lot of different restaurants, Nigerian restaurants, and get your favorite Nigerian taste of Nigeria that you miss, that many Nigerian immigrants miss. But I wanted to talk to you just about when you came to New Orleans and just you in this stall. And, we saw so many different food halls, throughout the country and other countries as well. I want you to talk about the economics of that and what that does also for entrepreneurs that are starting out.
Yeah, actually, you were super important, and I should say this because when I came to New Orleans, I didn't know anybody. I think the lady who would be my wife later on was, Claire, was who I knew, maybe one or two other people. But then, so like Black New Orleans, or definitely New Orleans, like food culture opened up to me through you. So you had come to the stall, you had talked about how, because you had lived in Nigeria for a little bit. So we had that in common. And so that's how we built our friendship. And then through you, I met a whole gang of people, like a whole gang of other like food people. So you sort of like opened my world to like New Orleans food and also like Black New Orleans culture too. Anyway, so the food hall experience was super interesting. By interesting, I mean I failed. I failed in my business. The biggest thing was that the food hall was restrictive. I know this is like a food and restaurant podcast maybe, but if you own a restaurant, you have to control your costs, right? Like you have to control your labor costs and your variable costs, your fixed costs, which is like your rent and that kind of stuff, like you can't really control. But the stuff that you should be able to control, your labor, your food costs, like those things you have to control. But if you were I was in the food hall, I couldn't control anything. They set the hours that we had to be open. So whether you were making money or not, you had to be open. So if they set those hours, then they also basically were in essence setting your labor hours, because you had to be staffed if you were open. And then if you were open, then you would have to have food to serve. So they were also like setting your food costs in a way. And then in that food hall, there was an innovative, aka extractive rental system, in that you paid a percentage of your sales, of your gross sales. So again, so then you couldn't control those margins. So either you paid like a percentage of your gross sales or you paid a minimum. And so sometimes, because my business wasn't doing so well, the minimum would be like 90 to 100% of my total sales. And in some instances, like I think I remember a couple of days or, I owed, I owed the food hall money for the privilege of being there, basically. So that was what was in part difficult. The other thing that I couldn't control was how my food was served and delivered. Because it was a food hall, folks just come to a counter. So I'll make the food, they'll come to the counter and I'll put it on the counter. It wasn't like an experience. The experience was you were in a food hall with, you know, 15 other vendors or so who had different foods. That was the experience. It wasn't like you were coming to my stall. So all of these things combined with, if I was being honest, my stubbornness at not wanting to change the menu really just caused the business to fail even before. I tell people that we started failing, we started losing money the day before we opened. It was that bad. Like we hadn't opened and we were just like pleading money. But the experience for me was great because it was the first time that I had been in a place consistently like making food. So I was, that sort of comfort in being in one place it just makes the food better. Folks like cooking, because I travel and I'm cooking in different kitchens. At least for me, it's hard to replicate a dish from place to place because there's so many variables. Like, the way an oven is in one kitchen is not the way it is in another kitchen. And in fact, like the way, even a stovetop is, the sort of like how you can regulate the heat and all that stuff is different. And all of these things affect, the quality or the outcome of the food. So being able to just be in one place and cook, for the time that I was there was great for me, great for my, for the food that I was making. But it was also tough. I remember, one time just calling my mom and crying. I have no idea why I was crying. I was just tired. I was like, I was working, and unfortunately, this is normal for a lot of folks who work in restaurants. But I was working in, the first couple of months, like 13 hours a day, like every single day, because we were open 7 days a week. And then I was cooking all the food because I still hadn't like trained the staff up. And then I was also watching my bank account like dwindle at the same time. So it's one thing to be like, to worry about how good the food tastes. It's also another thing to worry about, like, oh, can I make payroll? Every time I would walk into the store and I'll just see a staff of like 4 people. I'm like, God, am I paying these people right now? This is crazy. Like, I wish I could fire everybody, which I eventually had to do. I had to let people go. But yeah, it was a tough, like physically tough and demanding. But then the thing that I learned is, when things were really bad and I started basically not only not making any money, but losing money in that the rent that I was delivering to the food hall became more than what I was actually making in gross sales. I went to the management and I told them, and I was like, this is not sustainable. That you can't have, this like minimum amount that, you expect the vendors to pay, but you don't have a cap, right? So if you made $20,000 in the month, they would still take, the percentage. So they had this, basically, they had no limit to the amount of money that they could make, but then they had a floor in terms of how much they could lose. Their building was, highly subsidized, and you know the story that I think they were paying, some token amount in rent as a way to, offset, I guess, their investment in like, restoring this historical building. But anyway, in this conversation, when I was talking to the management and I said this, I said to them, I remember I said, like, you're going to have to change your model because this is not sustainable for the vendors. And the fellow said, no, I'm not. And I was like, oh, for real? He's like, yeah, I'm not going to have to change it. It was then I realized that like I was disposable, that when I left, somebody else was waiting to come in. And so this sort of conveyor belt of eager chefs and entrepreneurs who wanted a break were looking for it is what fed the machine. And so in that moment, like I didn't hold a grudge. I'm like, oh, this is his business model. Like he's not trying to be quote unquote like evil or anything. This is just how, when he wrote up his business plan, or the ownership team wrote up their business plan, this is, these were the terms that they stated. And so that's sort of like dispassionate, extractive capitalism. That was my first like interaction with it, and understanding about how it works, on at scale too, because it's not just the food hall. Like many restaurants, the idea that labor is disposable, and that there's always somebody else ready to take a job, I think is in part what like creates the sort of like exploitative situations that we have. I mean, I think maybe now the market is different in that unemployment is pretty low, so maybe things are different. But generally, in our economic system, I think labor is disposable.
When we come back, y'all, thank you for joining and listening to Culture and Flavor. We're going to talk to Tunde a little bit more about just some of the journey that he's been on and some of his writing, as well as his return to Lagos as an adult and his artist in residence, his latest artist in residence invitation. And we'll be back right after a few messages from our advertisers. Thanks, y'all, for joining us.
Whether you're a chef or just love going to restaurants, you know the best ingredients are everything, especially when it comes to beef. In Northern Australia, there's a different approach to raising high-quality beef. Westholme, based in Queensland and Northern Territory, is working with the land to create nature-led Australian Wagyu. Westholme stewards 16 million acres of rangeland guided by their natural ecosystem. They're led by a belief that if they balance the needs of their cattle with the needs of the environment, both can thrive. Westholme's team of rangeland experts and nature managers use a variety of tools to monitor and respond to the welfare of the environment, like satellites that assess grass health and on-the-ground research. Cattle are happier when they have the freedom to forage and explore, so Westholme ensures that they can roam wild, foraging at will for the first 2 to 3 years of their lives. Their cows graze on native grasses like Mitchell grass, which is only found in Australia, along with dozens of other plants, herbs, and seasonal legumes. The result is a high-quality Wagyu beef that reflects the terroir of Northern Australia and a flavor suited to complement any cuisine. Westholme believes that when nature leads, flavor follows. Learn more at westholme.com.
Okay, we're back. So I want to kind of start talking about your observations, because you wrote a piece for Oxford American. You wrote a piece for Oxford American called "Who Owns Southern Food?" This is a while ago with John T. Edge, and just your observations when you really started getting into writing on coming from Lagos to Detroit, now New Orleans. Of course, you traveled so many places, but that piece was one of your, I think, really introduced you to writing and to letting people know that you are an incredible writer. Can you talk a little bit about just how you were observing New Orleans and just some of the economic disparities and comparing it to other cities and just U.S. capitalism and where we are?
Yeah, it's interesting because that piece also has a story in it connected to you, in that when I was asked to write the piece by John T. So I had met John T. almost the same way that I met you. He came to the food hall when he was in New Orleans. I think he was writing a book, and he just happened to wander into the food hall, and he came to my stall, and we started talking, and we just became friends. I had no idea who he was or what he represented, in sort of like food canon and culture, and so that's how we initially became friends. And at the time, I was just cooking Nigerian food. I wasn't talking about race or anything. When my stall closed, I had time to breathe, right? Right before I opened my stall, I was detained by immigration. So I had spent this uncertain like month in detention in Texas, wondering if I was going to get deported or if I would have time to open up this store that I had the opportunity to open up. And so I went from, my life at the time was I opened up a restaurant. I left that restaurant in Detroit. I went on a tour. I got offered, a stall in New Orleans. I got offered in a way like an opportunity with the New York Times. They were going to come and come and write about this dinner that I was supposed to do in California. So it was supposed to be like this big piece that was going to, like, I guess, change my life. At least that's the way I thought. That's the way I thought about it. And then en route to that dinner in California, I got detained. And that's when I spent like about 20 days in detention. And then right after detention, I came into opening up food store. And then I spent the next 6 months like watching that food store fail. I also got married in that time. So there was this like, all to say there was this like 2-year period of just like a lot of activity. And so when the food store failed and closed, I had time to like sit down a little bit of time. And I spent like 6 months, I guess, or so just trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And that's when I decided to go on another tour, but this time talk about race and specifically Blackness. So fast forward to the article with John T. I had closed down the food stall, was, doing this like food and race conversations. I'd gotten some like national press. I think the Washington Post wrote this big piece about it. And then I started to get attention and I was traveling, which was good. And then John T came back into my life. I think we had kept in touch a bit, but then he came back and he invited me to some sort of like summit in Tennessee where there were a bunch of other chefs talking about race. And I think after that was when he asked me to co-write something with him. So I think there were like things happening in his world. For folks who don't know, John T was and is like this really central figure in Southern foodways, and folks can do their research about him. But he was, I guess, dealing with questions of race and and appropriation and ownership of Southern food in that world. And Zella, you're part of that too. That whole world. So you can give your listeners more context if you want. But anyway, so he came to me and he was like, we should write this thing together. And I didn't even think too much about it. I wrote it, and this is where the story comes back to you. I wrote it based on my experience and my experience traveling and cooking and talking about race, my recent experience in like learning about what Blackness means in a critical way, which is what I did after I closed the store. I spent time like reading and learning about like critical race theory. And when I was done with the draft, I sent it to you because you were one of the people that I shared my work with. And something that you said, and I'm not sure if you remember, at the time, I agree with the sentiment, but I think now, because I'm older and different things have happened, my agreement is a little bit complicated. But what you said was that there's a reason why John T once, like picked me or wanted to write with me, and as opposed to like an African American food writer, chef, or commentator. And you were talking about the sort of privilege, or not even privilege, but the sort of like position that Africans have. Like we are seen as less, in some instances, less confrontational, less angry. We are more palatable and digestible. And I hadn't quite heard that before. In my research or my thoughts or my thinking about race, but it made sense. I'm like, oh yeah, that's true. And so I actually included that in the piece. Do you remember that?
I do remember, and I'm just thinking of that time, period, and this was kind of after Katrina, and it was so many incredible New Orleans Black chefs who never were able to come to the table. It's changed I think, a lot, but still, has some definite challenges. I mean, there's tons of Black owned restaurants that are killing it right now. But back then, it was still really steeped and in the South in general, when you talk about Southern food, and they were just always, African was the last to be mentioned, even though the majority of enslaved Africans were doing the cooking. And so even with food writers, Black food writers, and to be fair, there aren't, at that time, there weren't a lot of Black folks, Black food writers in the South at that time, but they were here, right?
Yeah. I mean, there were enough where he could have asked like a bunch of people that weren't me, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, and you and I always kind of like have these intense, deep conversations that go for like 5 hours. So it was, it was this long debate about just where we are in this city, and not pulling from it without making sure that Native New Orleanians have their due, and not just Native New Orleanians, but in the South in general, that their voices are heard.
And like I said, I agree, I guess, in principle. I mean, but it's complicated, right? But I would say at the time it made sense, and it still makes sense. I have a friend who used to work for, I don't want to say the name of the company, but one of like a Fortune 500 or Fortune 50 company, and he worked in executive level positions. He said that his company at the time and other companies, they had maybe some internal diversity quota, like hiring, Black, brown folks, and that at a particular level, almost all of the Black folks were African. There was something about, I guess, African executives that made the white leadership more comfortable. But to your point, if there's like an unfortunate hierarchy of the Blacks that white folks want to interact with, unfortunately, I think Africans have taken up this more visible space, which is a problem. Anyway, you sort of like gave me that word, and I took it and I incorporated it into the piece, and I think I offered it back as a challenge to John T. So I'm definitely grateful to you for that. So that piece just became this thing that, I don't know, it blew up in places that I didn't know how popular John T was or how popular the conversation was, but that did definitely like took my career in food to the next level. I became not a national figure because it's not like I'm, fucking like Carla P. Hall or something, but I just, more people knew my work. And I, just to like wrap up this response, I'll be honest, the idea of me speaking about race and speaking about specifically the African American experience, which I wasn't necessarily speaking about, but I was speaking to, is something that now makes me uncomfortable because I'm reminded, and I have been reminded by African Americans, like by you in a much more gentle and like, friendly way, that I'm not African American. And I'm also reminded by myself because, I'll be trying to like speak that lingo. I'm like, it's just not working. The Nigerian in me just wants to say what he wants to say. Like I can't be anything but who I am.
Stop
I'm
it,
still
I'm rolling.
Yeah, it's not like, the way Black folks, talk. Like I can't do it. But even, seriously, like I don't have the same experience. Like my initial, and this is what you were speaking to, I think, is like when you told me about, when you were sort of like educating me about the relationship between Africans, African Americans, and white folks, is that my initial interaction or assessment of white folks is not suspicion. And that's important, because African Americans have a particular history, and in that history, white folks are antagonists. So you have to be suspicious of white folks. Me being a Nigerian and coming from a particular place, our suspicion of white folks is different. It's more like derision, or it's just a different like vibe. And then I'm also not under the same, at least, well, yeah, I can say this. I'm also not under the same like psychological regime, in that I was born in Nigeria. My father and mother were born in Nigeria. My grandparents, like my whole generation, for as far as we can tell, all in Nigeria. All the people around me, I grew up in power and in poverty, were all Nigerian. So I have my relationship to the hierarchy, that like the racial hierarchy that exists, is different. So anyway, all of this to say is that even though I was speaking words that I believe and I think are true, I'm not sure how much of it, was my place to say, at least publicly. And there was, like, to your point, there were so many other people who could have said the same thing.
Well, I mean, and what does that say, though, that, when we just look at this time, Blackness has so many nuances, and so it's not a monolith, right? And and to fight for this like one spot in whatever industry it is, to get the accolades or the opportunities, when we have so many voices. We have just even being African American is so many nuances to being African American. You're Nigerian, you're Yoruba, you're so many. There's Igbo, there's Hausa, there's Fulani. There's so many different nuances to who you are, And so I'm hoping that in this next part of, because the rise of West African chefs here in the States, the rise of African American voices being able to tell their stories, and still not even there yet. Yeah. But I'm hoping that, we continue as a collective to support each other, to speak our truths, whatever that is. Because we have to be storytellers. And I think about just like, I have to tell y'all this funny story. I hadn't seen Tunde in a long time, and he was traveling, and he went back to Lagos, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And he was able to finally return, see his parents, spend time with siblings. And I was so excited for him to go, because I know, just how much, it meant to him to go back and actually be in Lagos again. But anyway, so he invited me, he said, Z, I'm in Baton Rouge. Come and see me. And I'm like, all right. I drive out to Baton Rouge. I got to tell this story. So, I'm like, oh, I'm so excited. I get to see Tunde. I haven't seen him in a minute. That's my boy. And I get there, and everybody's so excited. It's kind of like the secret location, and we're waiting outside, and they give us these suits. And I'm like, okay, what are we doing with these suits? So we have to put on these blue suits, and then they pump air into the suit. So we're walking around looking like Oompa Loompas, and it's hot as hell in Baton Rouge, first of all. So, and then he made us put on these sleep masks on top of it. No, it was like a mask that we had to put over our eyes. So we're basically dining without seeing what we're eating. So, and it was hot as hell in there on top of it. So I'm sweating like a pig's in a blanket, right? And I was like, at one point, and everybody was just not saying anything, and nobody complained. They were just there for the experience and to support Tunde, And then on the wall, he had a projection of his mom, at church service in Lagos. And before I put my mask on, I was like, oh, I'm going to support him because that's my friend, and I was like, well, I'm going to roll with it, but I'm going to talk about him later, And so, and I was thinking like, oh, he's going to share about his time in Lagos and all of this, and, and maybe this has something to do. I know it had deeper meaning because Tunde has always been very deep, right? After 15 minutes, I had so much sweat coming down my neck. I came to the kitchen. I was like, yo, I'm not wearing. He was like, well, I didn't know you would last that long.
You're a wild one. You were right.
They had to put me in a room, and with the fan and the AC. I was like, I'm not going back out there.
Yo, man.
Hilarious.
That dinner was wild, but that dinner was. I mean, it goes back to all the things that you're talking about. This idea of how we are all sort of like we all have multi-dimensional identities, right? And I think in one way, the problem with me being like representative of like African Americans in food at that particular time wasn't necessarily what I was saying or who gets to say what, but that is that we all have to we've all had to rely on this very limited identity as a way to earn, if you will, as a way to be seen. And I'm not there is, because I think you and I definitely come from at least one school of progressive politics, like this idea that like there's a certain that people are oppressed and extracted from, and the way that we sort of like understand oppression is through identity, but that's limiting, and it's also unfortunate. And so if you're black, you have to be blackety black, or a particular kind of black. And if you are queer, you have to be like a particular kind of queer. And if you're black and queer, oh, kudos to you, because now you're like more oppressed. If you're black, queer, and are not abled, conventionally or whatever, that's another. So it's like folks like us have to keep racking up, these demerits, so that we can then identify ourselves through that lens. And that's the problem to me, and that's also the distraction, because we're not talking about the ultimate thing that we should be talking about, which is in my mind, our emotional and spiritual well-beings. But before we get to that place, we are not talking about like the material hierarchies that exist, in that some of us have and some of us don't. And so like we can be talking about blackness in America with African Americans and with other folks, but we're not conscious enough that, to your point, there are different kinds of blackness. Like there's some rich black folks who are all about black excellence and all of that stuff. And there are working class black folks, and there are folks in between. There are folks who have, who come from working class stock but have educational privilege. So there's this like spectrum of blackness. And because we are sometimes so consumed with the racial identity, like it obstructs our criticality. Like we are not thinking often about the ways in which our blackness is different and what that difference means materially for different kinds of black folks. It's the same reason why Africans come to the United States and are able to like think that they may be better or something than black folks here. It's also the same reason why educated and elite African Americans think that they're better than working class black folks. It's the same reason why some working class black folks think that they are better or superior to Africans. So we have all of this like interlocking relational conflicts and tensions, which they're fine. They're all, tension is in a way natural. But until we begin to think more critically, by we, I mean, not just Africans or African Americans or whatever, or even, Americans, it's like all of us have to start thinking critically about what material circumstances exist and how we participate in these systems that are exploitative, that are materially exploitative, and what we can do to begin like undoing the system with grace, and that we're offering grace to ourselves and to other people. But we can't rely on this like limited, identity spectrum as the way that we begin to judge things like access and privilege. It's just too limited in my mind. And so that dinner that I did, that was wild. We would the premise of the dinner was death. My
Yeah.
mother had just passed, and so I was coming. It's so crazy. I was coming right out of my mother's funeral in Nigeria to Baton Rouge to host the dinner, and she was on my mind, and so that's why she was projected on the screen. And so I was dealing with death, and I'm not sure how much your audience knows about your personal life, but you were also dealing
No,
with,
no, no. Yeah,
yeah,
my mom was transitioning at that point. So to have you, have those long conversations with you and
yeah,
how we're dealing with grief and being vulnerable, because no one understands
hmm,
until you go through it. I mean, you're like, oh, I'm so sorry you lost your mom, but when you lose your mom, and then when
yeah,
you talked to earlier in the conversation about how you called your mom up and cried,
hmm,
who I used to call my mom up and cry all the time,
yeah,
and she literally, like, so many times when I would write or whatever, and even this last book that Ed Mitchell's Barbecue that put out, it was her, pushing me like, no, do this way, do that way,
hmm,
and it's like when they're gone and you don't have, as like the other day I wanted to call her, and I just started speaking out in the air, just hoping that
yeah.
she would hear me, you know it's
Yeah,
deep.
it's such a huge loss, and I, often now I'm just like, I just be walking and just think about my mom. I'm like, "Mommy, I love you." I'm just like, "Thank you, mommy." I just do that now because I still can't believe it. It's like wild. I was actually I haven't cried since my mom died. I was watching a video on Instagram or something about somebody just returning back home after 9 years and just realizing that their mom was gone and they were crying. It made me cry too. I'm like, I can't believe that has happened. But the going back to that, to that dinner, trying to tie all this together is that I was dealing and contending with grief, and you and I were having conversations around that because you had also lost your dad like a couple of
Yeah.
years prior to that. So you were in a way like helping me through that grief. But then I was also dealing with this idea that we're all going to die a physical death. So that's a grief that I'm thinking about. But then we have all these like social identities that also need to die a social death. Like we as individuals need to die some sort of social death, in that that are our projections in society. So our race, our gender, our class position, all of these things, in a way, and in different times, need to be decomposed if we want to create more equitable communities. And so the sort of like the masks and the suits and the restrictions in the space were ways to begin to like separate the individual diners from the identities. But you were like, fuck that, I'm hot as fuck, I'm gonna snatch this. So fuck all that social death, I'm about to die a real death in the suit.
And it's not like he had it in Chicago or New York. He had it in Baton Rouge in the summer. Like, come on,
In the
son.
swamps.
Oh my God. Hilarious. No, but it was, I think, just where you're headed on this journey. And, now I think both of us have a lot more wisdom than we
Mhm,
had, and, when I think also about media, there
mhm,
still isn't enough Black media in the world,
mhm.
and I think, I mean, yes, we have social media where we have, influencers who, do a TikTok video every now and then. But when I think about just our parents' generation and the
Yeah.
sources of information that they had and the time they also had, even though they were working very hard, to
Mhm.
read, to have conversations that go beyond surface level, right? I think we are in and what my dad said before he died, he said, we are in an axial age. And I believe that.
What does that mean?
Basically, we're in not a transitionary period, but this humanity, this is the information age, but it's also the lack of information age. You know what I mean? And so it's a paradigm shift that's happening globally. I mean, we see that with everything that's going on and just how fast either information gets out there, but also how identities are sometimes destroyed in seconds. How we're also kind of making identities as well, making new identities, but there's still a very isolating time period. And I see that sometimes even when I go to visit other places and outside of the US, and they're even talking about how, so much of the traditions of just breaking bread with each other and having conversations with each other is moving away, is dwindling away. So,
yeah, I was just in Cincinnati a couple of weeks ago, and for some reason, it struck me when I entered this restaurant bar, it's just like a bunch of people eating and drinking. And I was just like, we're still not using food and, restaurants and dining spaces and media to its full potential. Right? There's still so much that we can do with food and dining that isn't just, oh, come and eat this food because it's delicious, or come and eat this food because it's clever, because the chef, did something and put something here or did something there, or come and drink this drink or whatever. Like, there's so much more that we can do. Like, to your point about identities being created and destroyed, and this sort of like transitory space, we have so many, and I'm not here to preach or anything, but we have so many problems, big, small, internal, in that, so we have like interpersonal problems and like larger public problems, or, food can play a role in all of these spaces. Food can help get folks together. Food can help us like be more critical. And, I think there's just not enough folks maybe thinking in that direction. I think we still have a lot of folks who think about food just as, either as physical nourishment or as, physical pleasure, which is fine. And I love all of those things. But, a few more people doing critical food work on a national or international stage is still necessary. That's what I think about, where we are now, and like what the potential gaps are, or the obvious gaps are in like food production and media production.
I want to bring it back to Nigeria. And you went back to Lagos. Lagos is one of my favorite cities in the world. I lived there for a bit in Lekki Phase 1. And, my first cousins are actually, their dad is Nigerian. So I grew up in Chicago at a very interesting time when the first kind of group of Nigerians came in student visas and taxi drivers. And my uncle, Joseph, who was Igbo, he married my aunt. And so I remember their house growing up. My cousin Obi moved back to Lagos and he lives there now. But I remember, just the house was always full of people, and that was my first introduction to Nigerian cuisine, was through my uncle. Right. And, and just, there weren't any divisions between Igbo, Yoruba, or whoever was there. I even had Ghanaians there. I mean, everybody brought their food, and all the aunties were always feeding us, you know. And to see, I remember like even when you were here, like Afrobeats still hadn't really hit the South yet.
No, hadn't popped, no.
Right. Mm-hmm. And we were just like, I would play it and people were like, what is that? Mm-hmm. And even still, I mean, DJ OJ and some others here in New Orleans, and I'm sure in other cities in the South, it's starting to come. I mean, the heartbreak was when Burna Boy had canceled his New Orleans leg because there wasn't enough. Really? Yeah. This was recently. But I would love for you to talk about, just so we can end this and center
Yeah.
this just on who you are and your roots about Lagos, and just painting the picture of those who have never been, what makes Nigeria so special, what makes Yoruba people so special, because it's a deep, 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 long, long, long history, ancient history.
Yeah.
And as it's being entered into the American market, because, they have Asian cuisine, all types of Latin American cuisine, but Africa is still, there, and the young West African chefs are doing it, and they're pushing so hard, even East African chefs, So I would love for you to kind of just paint the picture for our audience on what makes Nigeria so special and how you see the West African foodways entering into the American market.
Yeah. So I think earlier you had said, that I'm not just Black, I'm, Nigerian and I'm Yoruba. And so like we have all these different like Black identities, but really I'm not even Yoruba, I'm Yoruba in that my dad is Yoruba, but so many people have said, I go to Nigeria and people be like, where are you from? And I'm like, I'm Yoruba. You can't be Yoruba, it's not possible. I'm like, what do you mean I'm Yoruba? But my mom is like Edo and Ishekiri, and then my dad is Yoruba and Efik. So I'm like a mix of things, and so what that means practically is that in my house we ate fan, which Efik dishes. We ate afiafere, and my mom would come with like we'll eat puru and owo, and then we'll eat like then I guess more traditional Yoruba food. Like in fact we barely had Yoruba food in the house. We're just eating all of these different things because my parents are from different places, and my mom's both my parents speak like 3 different languages each. Unfortunately, I only speak English. So there was all of that. There is all of that happening, and so yeah, I'm very much at least if not very Nigerian, I'm very like southern Nigerian from the southern part of Nigeria, and Nigeria is special to me because they're just it's my people, is where I'm from, is where I'm most comfortable, or it's definitely at least the people with whom I'm most comfortable. I don't have to like put on this fake American accent that I have right now. I can just
Stop it.
I can be
Just
myself.
be you.
Yeah, I can like it's just like not to say that Nigeria is always comfortable for me, but it's sort of like my spiritual, it's definitely my spiritual home. I tell folks that before going into Nigeria for me is difficult, and I'm usually coming from the West, which has all of the amenities and things that folks enjoy, and then travel is also a thing, and I'm like, oof, I have to go back. All right, cool. I have to psych myself up, and but when I get home, to leave is a problem. I'm like, oh God, I have to go back to America again, So yeah, Nigeria is special. However, obviously, with all due respect, Nigeria is also fucked, and it's hard for me. I find myself when I talk about Nigeria only talking about the things that are a problem. But these things I'm talking about are material things, the things that are like infrastructurally problematic. And the only reason why I bring them up because the problem of Nigeria is dialectic, if I can use that word, which is like it's in conversation with the successes of the West, and that so every comfort, every sort of privilege that folks in the United States enjoy is at the expense of places like Nigeria. Period. What did that person say? Mary had a little lamb or something, that fellow like on period. That's it. It's like you can't even argue that. And so for me, when I think about Blackness and I think about how I had been talking about it or how folks talk about it and how maybe I have contributed to that conversation, I think of Americanness, in that being African American or being any American, makes you part of an imperialist project, you know. And it's great to be conscious about that. But even if you are conscious about it, you're still part of that project. And that project is, creates dispossession and havoc elsewhere. I can tell you, I mean, like one simple way, and there are many ways that we can dissect this, but we don't have time. But one simple way is just the hegemony of the US dollar. That because the dollar is the dominant medium of trade internationally, it creates severe pressures on economies outside of the United States, especially economies in the third world countries that produce either cash crops or commodities that are being used to buoy the American or the Western consumptive experience. So that is important to say. So the only, for me, the biggest reason why I talk about Nigeria being fucked is to say that our state of fucked upness, if I can say that, is not independently induced. Is that we are in a complex, we're in a global complex, and that it is to the benefit of the West, of the United States, and everybody living in here, that places like Nigeria and the so-called global South remain impoverished, remain in these polarized conditions where you have like super wealthy people and then like unbelievably poor people, struggling for resources in conflict, and that these circumstances are by design, and this design benefits Americans. I don't care what kind of American you are, how black you are, how queer you are, how democratic you are, or Democrat you are, or liberal you are benefiting. And this isn't to present it to folks in a way to paralyze folks, but knowledge is important, right? Like we can know, and then we can begin again with grace, individually and collectively, start to find ways to really think about what like global repair and reparations mean, and try and remove ourselves from a Western centric or American centric idea of justice, because that justice is problematic. So that's my spiel.
That was powerful, y'all. I would love to engage further with Tunde because, we could talk literally all night and all day. But because we're on this podcast, we're going to have to invite him back for further, debates and conversations. We really appreciate that you tuned in, y'all. And thank you, Tunde, so much, my dear friend. I really appreciate you for joining Culture and Flavor, and I'm looking forward to inviting you back. And just quickly, what are some of the things that you're doing right now? I saw that you are going to do an artist in residency.
Yeah, I just finished an artist residency in Cincinnati. I'm working on a documentary, which I think we've talked about, but I
think you sent me the clip.
Yeah, so we're probably going to release that sometime, I don't know, late fall or early next year. We're still working through distribution. So I'm doing that. I'm starting a fellowship later in the fall.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so I'm just sort of like, I'm working and I'm thinking, and I'm, thinking about money and what it means and how we can use it to change things. I'm also starting an investment fund, or I've started one actually. So just a bunch of different things. Yeah.
Well, we appreciate your work, and we appreciate your voice. I think it's so important to have critical thinking. I'm thinking about, some of the latest rap beefs, critical thinking is powerful.
Yeah. Drake dropped all the balls.
Triple entendres, triple entendres.
Yeah.
We need more of that.
Yeah, me too.
But that's a whole nother episode to talk about. So I want to thank y'all for joining Culture and Flavor. So thank you all so much. And thank you, Tunde. We'll talk soon.
All right. Thank you.
Culture and Flavor is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network, food radio supported by you. Keep in touch at heritageradionetwork.org.